we have to really start with how fundamentally powerful culture is, all forms of culture, including visual art, music, language.
We can rebuild buildings, we can rebuild bridges, we can rebuild schools, but if we do not incorporate our story, our art, and our culture, and our history.
A cultural framework. The theme for our community is community, culture, and commerce. And that's not just what Ashe says, that's what everybody says.
Part of the creative placemaking work is not about arts and culture on its own, but arts and culture as it is integrated in how we think of healthy communities.
What's important to you, what's important to me, how might we use arts and culture to advance our joint missions?
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Bienvenue à Arnaudville. Bienvenue à la Semaine de la Francophonie. Je m'appelle Huey Weibel, je travaille pour le Chambre de commerce ici à Arnaudville. Today, we're here to celebrate the French language, our culture, the environment, and creativity. Again, thank you all for being here. I would like to pass the microphone to our state representative, Mike Uval. Mr. Mike.
Bien, merci Huey. Et c'est bon pour être avec vous autres ce matin. C'est une belle journée. Ça n'a pas commencé belle, ça a commencé avec la pluie. Parce que ce soir aussi, le soleil va commencer. La journée va continuer, le soleil va venir plus. Welcome everyone here. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being in Arnaudville. And not many people in Arnaudville realize how important Arnaudville has been in my life. Not only mine, but my family's. Back in the days when my grandpa was raising sweet potatoes, Arnaudville was a big sweet potato area, so he sold his sweet potatoes here. When my dad grows up at the age, he comes to the movie theaters here. Not many people remember that my dad's best friend was Mr. James Laporte, who was from Arnaudville. James Laporte and my dad were best friends. In the 11th grade, Mr. James Laporte mysteriously leaves school, and my dad doesn't know why he's left. Well, his widowed mother needed money, and they had a lot of kids, and James joined the service, not because he wanted to see the world, but so he could send his mother $40 a month. So Arnaudville plays a very important part in my life. A couple of people here I want to recognize. I can't recognize everybody because I'll forget. I want to recognize Miss Rita and George. And I want to recognize them because they had the foresight to start something many years ago called NUNUs. And on Saturday nights, Doc Uval and I would come to NUNUs because Doc said, Mike, that's where we go on Saturday night. I said, fine. And one thing I can distinctly remember by going to NUNUs was Miss Rita's famous ham and fig sandwich. Doc would say, Mike, c'est bon, a ham and fig sandwich? I said, the doctor will say it. But anyhow, first place I had ever eaten was a ham and fig sandwich was a NUNU. So I want to thank them for what the vision that they had for what we have today. Fortunately for me, I serve in Baton Rouge and I serve in the House floor. And not every day, but almost weekly, there will be people from a different French-speaking country that come to the back. And about 95% or higher of the people in the house do not speak French. So they'll either call me, Trubus, Claire, Labar, or Reed Falconer. I think there's the four of us that can still speak French. Said, Mike, you got somebody in the back that wants to speak French. So most of these people can't speak English, but when they have somebody that on this side of the world that can speak French, it's like their eyes lighten up. And it gives you a good feeling too, because you know you're doing something that you think is simple, but they enjoy speaking to somebody from Louisiana that can actually speak French. And I was in a meeting recently, and I asked these people, said, what brought you to Louisiana? So we came here because there's French speaking here, there's French speaking communities, we wanted to come here. They always come through New Orleans. That's fine. New Orleans can be the gate. But once they get through the gate, they're coming westward to what I'll call Acadiana or Cajun area. Because they look at these places because they want to come to a place where French is spoken or there's a French heritage. And French immersion is helping to keep our language alive. I was fortunate. I lived next door to my grandparents who only spoke French. So that was the only way I could communicate with them. So I learned the language. And I continued it. Whenever there was somebody that I could speak with, I would always do it. And the better they were, the better it was for me because they challenged me to help me with the vocabulary. Even this day, when I will speak to somebody who speaks French, they will say something and I say, hold up, I want you to tell me what you said in English because I want to learn that word. Because I didn't have a formal French education as a child. Of course, my grandparents' vocabulary was limited. I did take it in school. It's amazing. What I learned as a child, I've retained better than what I learned in school. But what I think we need to do is, our state is doing well because we're bringing tourism here. There's also an opportunity for economic growth in our state because of the French that we're speaking. Last year I went to Quebec City. Monica and I went there, and it's amazing. Everywhere you go, everyone who serves you speaks English and French, and they will ask you, en anglais or en français. Again, I would always tell them, en français. Almost every time, they would say something that I didn't know, I'd never heard the word before. I said, again, say it in English, but I want you to say it in French. That's the only way I learn new words. So I really have enjoyed that. Our area is very unique. You just don't realize until you get away from here. Because, there's people from the state that have a lot of different things, but there's only one place in Louisiana where French is spoken. That's Acadiana. New Orleans says, they have the French in Natchitoches, where once upon a time I think French was the only language spoken. Went there about 3 or 4 years ago. Other than a small community not far from Natchitoches where they speak Creole, which is what I actually speak. Miss Reed may be aware of that. French is not spoken there any longer. Another funny story. My dad and Miss Reed know each other. So the first time I meet Miss Reed, I said, d'où tu viens, Mike? Je viens de Pop. Non. Et où papa devient? Je viens de Sicilia. Et tu parles créole. C'est Arnaudville ne parle cajun, Sicilia ne parle créole. So a community that's 7 miles apart, different words, we can still understand each other. My mom, who's from Parks, when she goes to visit with them, when my dad goes to start courting my mom, some of the words my dad would speak, the French was the wrong language spoken back then, my mom didn't understand what he was saying. That's only 14 miles apart. So, but we all can understand each other. Some people say that's that. Sometimes I'll visit with somebody and say, I don't speak the good French. I said, Mike, tu parles français, c'est tout la même affaire. There's just different moyens to parler français. So I've learned to realize that, yes, there's different languages. There's a way to speak French, but we all speak French. I want to tell a story to my friend I just met from Haiti. I visited Martinique last year, and they have a museum called the Museum of Enslaved People. It's a beautiful museum. What it stands for is beautiful also. So anyhow, the person there, the museum keeper, is a tall Creole man. I mean, I'm not far from being tall, but he's like about a foot taller than me. So he hadn't heard me speak. So I started speaking Creole, and he was amazed. His eyes lit up. He called his friend and said, Viens voir, un bout de la Louisiane qui parle Creole. So it's amazing where you go, people enjoy the language. So I'm lucky I can speak it. I told George I was going to 10:30 Max. I plan to do that. It's just about 10:30. So I want to thank you so much for having me. And I can assure you, anything that I can ever do for Arnaudville, or the Creole language, or the Cajun language, or the French language, I'm there to help. Before I leave, I just want to introduce my good friend, Mr. Bill. Mr. Bill and I's relationship goes way back before he was a parish president, before I was a state representative. Mr. Bill was once upon a time the head of DOTD in Lafayette. We became good friends there because even when you're on a parish council, even though you don't have anything to do with state roads, you're always going to be have a good relationship with the gentleman with DOTD. So Bill and I's relationship started a long, long time ago. So he's been a good friend, and I continue to enjoy our friendship. So I'm sorry that I have to leave, but it's been a joy being here, as it always is a joy being in Arnaudville. Bien, merci vraiment aujourd'hui. Nous souhaite que vous passez une bonne semaine sur la semaine française. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. You're a good friend, like you said. We've been
Absolutely.
good friends, and Michael and I traveled the same path virtually with parents and grandparents that spoke French, but he was smarter than me. He learned his French early, and he kept practicing it. So I'm not nearly as good as Mike is, so mine will all be in English, but I do understand it.
You understand what I'm saying? That's why I didn't say anything bad about Bill, because he may not speak it, he can understand.
Because as children, our parents spoke both French and English, and of course they switched right to French when they didn't want us to know what was going on, so we really learned what was going on for that reason. But Mike, thank you for what you do in the legislature and as a person, and you certainly do represent, and you're already doing a whole lot for the French movement here, and to continue to celebrate our culture, and we love you for that, and I know you'll always be there because that's what you are. So thank you so much. We
Thank
love
you for those kind words.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Good being with you all.
Mike does awesome work, and what you see is what you get.
This is George's cheat sheet.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you, Michael.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Michael. Be safe. So my presentation in my vehicle on the way here was much better than what I'll deliver here. You know, it's always better when you do it in your truck. You know, it sounds better. You get up here, you kind of forget, and it just runs from you. I certainly cannot be more sincere than Mike is about the heartfelt feelings that we have about our culture and about continuing to live our culture. Creole, Cajun French, Indian, and what I have learned, I'm a civil engineer by profession, worked 38 years, like Mike said, for Louisiana DOTD for the state, and I come from a family of French speakers and farmers, and my grandfather always insisted that when we arrived at his house, even when we were 6 years old, 7 years old, my dad was bringing us over there at the end of the day after he worked very hard for the government at that time in Soil Conservation Service, speaking French to the farmers and helping them learn about conservation, all as just a matter of making a living, but again, living in the culture of French. And so proud to have visitors at night when we used to visit in the 50s when I was a kid. That was, that's how we lived, and we live too fast today to be able to celebrate one another's happiness and issues. But actually, you call on your neighbor today. We still live that culture. We actually help our neighbors work through and walk through life with their challenges, with their celebrations. It's always good to visit. My spirit always runs very high when I walk in this building. Again, I was a civil engineer, and we work with truths and with technical business. But when I was 41, I was fortunate to get a job as a regional director for Acadiana region, it removes the parish lines. You get to meet all of the folks from all of the different communities, and like Mike said, you will hear different French dialects from the different communities, but they all have the same genuine feelings in common, that they're very proud of their culture. Now, don't get me wrong, we have some knuckleheads too, that don't get it, but they're still living their French culture. They're very convicted. They have strong convictions, and that's one of the good things in our heritage as well. But life is too short for us to not get along for too long, right? So while we're here, I'm certainly committed, and I know those of us in this room, and a lot of folks out there that just don't have the time, and they're busy with their lives. But this is such a wonderful thing that's happening in our Acadiana region. One of the greater focuses of it, and the educational pieces that have really risen to the top, and has gotten a lot of publicity, good publicity. People come here, like Mike said, because of who we are. We don't have a Grand Canyon or an Empire State Building or a Smoky Mountain, but we have ourselves. And people come because of us, and a lot of them stay. So, that's very much an indication of who we are and the value of who we are. And I just couldn't be more proud. And my dad had passed away 4 years ago. I was starting to tell him about NUNUs because I've been in this job now 6 years. And he actually was looking forward to coming to visit, and when he fell sick, and he never was sick, and then he passed away shortly after. My mom is still around. She hasn't made it here yet, but she's 80-something and still celebrating every day with her 89-year-old sister, and is very healthy. So anyway, this is a great place to be. Not only are we celebrating our culture, but we're a very, very informed, smart group, and there are many talents here that we're learning from. I think what we're doing is leaving our part of the legacy of our culture so that it continue to have our children and grandchildren hopefully be proud of where they're from. I tell my children they should always know from whence they come so that they can tell their children and their grandchildren, and that I would hope they would mention my name when I'm gone every now and then hopefully their children will mention their name when they're gone, because we all want to be remembered, right? But we need to do our part while we're here, and I think I know we're doing it here, to continue to leave a place better than it was when we arrived. So it's life is short, so we must do all we can to. Hi, Cheryl. I love you, Cheryl. You're awesome. Cheryl is a wonderful part of my life and still is. She's more of a distant now. She's at the governor's office. She's at a higher level, so she's helping all she can there. And Gabe, thank you for all you've done there when you worked there. You guys are awesome. And so many good people here, very smart people. More people need to come. Hopefully they'll continue to come. But this is an Acadiana movement. Like George says, we all have these little, here's a description, we're all spinning in this effort, and not only here in Arnaudville, but if you go to Eunice and Lafayette and Mamou, you'll find all of this pride. Now, you know, we're just going to all try to work within our space, and eventually those spinning units will come together and everything will be much better in life. Like a priest told me once, you know, today I was asking him, I said, you know, with the technology, we can turn on our phones and look at any space in the world, the poorest countries, the places that are where people are starving, and you know, it seems like we're sitting here happy and fat, and why can't we do more? And he said, well, you need to do what you can where you are to make it as good as it can be, and hopefully if everybody does that in their own way, the world will become a better place. So God bless you all. Thank you for being here. I'm so proud to be, I'm the president of St. Anthony Parish, but I'm also the chairman of the Acadiana Planning Commission, which has a very big space of resources to be able to help with this effort. They have become, this Acadiana Planning Commission, which is a commission of all parish presidents in the region, come to value in the last couple of years the value of what we have here and across our region. So thank you for being here. You honor us by being with us, and I'm just so proud to be a part of it. So thank you, all of you.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I want to introduce someone that really started the whole French piece here in Arnaudville. And she's not going to like the fact that I'm getting ready to say this, but she has been knighted by the French government. So she is, I'm going to be in so much trouble, but maybe it's the name of the award is Ordre de Bonne Académie. So Mavis, would you please come up and welcome everyone to Arnaudville?
Merci, George. I am an Arnaudville native. Je suis native d'Arnaudville. Et j'ai grandi sur une petite ferme avec 7 sœurs dans la campagne, c'est de Saint-Denis. Et c'est là où j'habite aujourd'hui. Mon mari était dans le service militaire, alors pendant 25 ans, on a resté au Japon, au Texas, en Floride, et on est revenu après sa retraite ici à notre petite ville. Ça avait changé beaucoup. Il y avait un feu dans Arnaudville. There was one traffic light. It was at the foot of the Bayou-Teche Bridge. C'était au pied du pont de Bayou-Teche. Et après 25 ans, nous autres on appelle ça la lumière, le stoplight, avait changé et c'était au pied du pont de Markusen. Ça, c'était le grand changement. Jusqu'à NUNU. Parce que avant NUNU, on n'avait pas de musique, we had no music, on n'avait pas de danse, on n'avait pas de French table, on n'avait pas de quilting service, on n'avait pas de circle, on n'avait pas de potluck. We existed, but we lacked a lot. And man, wow, the changes that have come about. Moi, j'ai seulement demandé, hey, Georges, j'aimerais faire une table de français. What's that? I said, well, Dwyer's in Lafayette is a little restaurant, and if you sit at this table on Tuesday morning from 7 to 9 o'clock, they will speak only French at that table. Si tu t'es assis à cette table, c'est que le français pour 1 heure, 7 heures, 8 heures, whatever. I'd like to try that. Oh, Miss Mavis, you think that's going to work? Yes. Why? I will bake them. They will come. No. What do you mean bake them? I will offer coffee and beignets, like coffee to on beignets. So, July, on a propane burner, on the bayou bank, blazing hot. At one point, he came and shook Miss Mavis. I just counted 125 people. Il y a 125 personnes ici pour parler en français ce matin. Il le croyait pas. And so, from the French table, it's like it snowballed. And it's been ongoing 12 years, our French table. And now, I'm so proud to say there are French tables throughout Acadiana. I know Mr. Millenson is aware of that. And they're wonderful. I wish I could make them all. And when I get invited, I go. And the Creole said, hey, would you come give us your template? How do you do it? So we gather. You know, we work with just volunteers, NUNUs. C'est que des bénévoles ici, c'est NUNU. Il n'y a personne qui fait de l'argent. On est bien pauvres, il faut qu'on aide. On n'a pas d'argent. Mais on peut fonctionner quand même. Ça fait tous les bénévoles. On était allé à Arnaudville pour faire la table de français. On a emmené les petits gâteaux, on a emmené les door prizes, on a fait tout ça pour eux. And there were, 30-something of them and 12 of us that went and got them started. So they have their own French table going. And so many all through Acadia. But it's just amazing. And please look in the other room. On a des petits posters sur la muraille. C'est toutes les écoles, different universities that have come here that want to spend a day with us. Some universities spend a week with us and we do a week of French immersion. And we use our local people to do this with us. The first night, the icebreaker, is a night of bourrée. On connaît bourrée? C'est un jeu de cartes. Et le premier soir, avec des étudiants, c'est avec les gens de la ville, qui vont parler que le français, qui vont visiter avec ces jeunes étudiants qui viennent, qui vont les montrer comment jouer ce jeu de cartes. Et the little community becomes the classroom. Il y a un homme qui va les montrer comment faire des pralines, comment faire des tartes, on va les montrer comment attraper les épilémistes, mais tout est fait en français. So if you look in the other room, you will see how many universities that have come. Please do, Mr. Millenson. Mr. Millenson and Mr. Bill, thank you all. Elected officials who take time out from their busy, busy lives to come to show support, we're so grateful to you for doing that. Because without your help and your support, you know, we want that little hospital in the middle of town. This will be its logo. This will be our French Immersion Campus and Cultural Center someday. Soon, we hope. Because schools want to come and we can't do it without lodging. We can't do it. We piece it together best as we can and they keep coming back for more. It's just incredible. Anyway, I'm talking too much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to, I love to see women in power because for too long we were not. But like Gay Hamilton and Cheryl, Miss Alice who works for Washington, these young women, that is so beautiful to see you in power. And it does my heart good because I worked in banking where early on it was a men's domain, that banking business. Miss Ann knows about that. Yeah. Thank you. Have a wonderful time and welcome to Arnaudville.
Robert, I know we're kind of changing the schedule. Do you want to say a few words as the new executive director of the Centre International de la Paix?
Thank you very much. I'm Robert Melanson, and as of February 1st, I'm the new director of the Lafayette International Center. As you may know, Philippe Gustin has retired. He was there for 28 years, and so I'm attempting to fill his shoes. But I have to say, Philippe has been very generous with his time and his support, so the transition has been fairly smooth so far. So if I can just say briefly, in my lifetime, having been born and raised here, I noticed that our cultural identity has sort of gone through three phases. The first is when I was a very small child, being Cajun or being Creole and speaking Cajun French or Creole was an embarrassment. It was still, I was at the tail end of that phase where, you know, if three of the four grandparents that I had were native speakers of French. But whenever I would, for example, come outside and hear them speaking to neighbors, they would switch to English when they saw me come. Or, you know, it was that sort of thing where people really tried to shield us from the French-speaking experience because it's as if they didn't want to contaminate us and have us experience the same hardships and difficulties and oppression that they experienced. So, as I was aging, as I was growing up, there was a little bit of an awakening because Codeville was founded the same year that I was born. And so that's when the French teachers started to come in and people started to, you know, appreciate the music that we had here. But at the age of 17, I graduated from high school and I left. And I went to Washington, D.C. to study diplomacy. And I never really felt as though I had much of a Cajun identity until I left Louisiana. And I realized just how different things were and that the negative view of Cajun and Creole culture that existed in Louisiana actually existed elsewhere. That when people found out I was not from New Orleans, they just didn't understand what could be good about Louisiana if it's not New Orleans. And as a student of diplomacy, I wanted to study Russian and Spanish, and I was told, well, that's great, but if you want to study diplomacy, the first language you have to study is French. And I thought, why on earth would I study French? Does anybody really use French anymore? What value could that bring? Well, when I started studying French, I realized that even though I wasn't fluent in French, I had a tremendous advantage over my classmates who had no French background. And I thought, wow, this is the first time in my life that being Cajun was an advantage in something. And that was an awakening that has influenced the rest of my life. Well, anyway, fast forward, I traveled and lived in different parts of the US and different parts of the world for 30 years, and eventually made my way back to Louisiana. And so I got to experience this awakening, this cultural awakening that we've gone through here in Louisiana as an outsider looking in on Louisiana. And it's a transformation that I never would have expected to happen in my lifetime. That now people, not only in Louisiana but outside of Louisiana, appreciate the things that we have to offer. And that in many ways being Cajun or Creole is actually cool. And so I think we're very much in that phase right now, that second phase where we appreciate the value that our language and our culture has. But I see that right now we're on the cusp of a new phase, of a third phase that's beginning, which is not only does French bring us tremendous cultural advantages, but it also brings economic advantages. And so that's my role as the director of the International Center is I definitely need to preserve all of the fantastic things that Philippe Gustin has worked so hard to put in place, all of the relationships that we have with governments, with academic institutions, But when I was hired specifically, the mayor of Lafayette focused on my business background and said, it's great that we have all of these networks and connections, but now we need to make it pay. And that's what we need to do. We need to turn all of these advantages that we've worked so hard to build into an economic advantage. And so that's what my role is, and that's what my mission is. And I'm happy that now that I've returned to Louisiana at this exciting time when something new is beginning, that I have a chance to make a contribution to the culture that I was born and raised in. So, and I'd like to say also, I hope that the awakening that I had in French I'll have a similar awakening with Creole. I very much would like to see that sort of thing happen in Louisiana. So.
Okay, so, Ann Markusen, would you please come on?
Oh.
So, y'all, Ann Markusen is a rock star in the field of creative placemaking. And you are. And she's going to present to us today, so everyone pull out their notepads and everything else, and she's going to give us some really good information. So, Ann?
Thank you so much. Well, it's so great to be here. I'm so embarrassed that I don't speak French. Even though I passed an exam for my PhD that said I was competent in reading French, and I do understand the words a lot. I'm going to ask people over here to come and sit at the tables because I have to stand here to advance the slides, and you don't want people to get my back. Right? So, and yes, hopefully we are going to do a writing exercise, so we'll see how this goes. So I was so thrilled to be invited back, and I want to just say quickly that we did Arnaudville and Humphrey case studies for our white paper, our sort of frame setting piece for the National for the Arts Creative Placemaking Experience. And we chose Arnaudville because we wanted a small place, but we also wanted something that was very unique and powerful, and that used the features of the place as a part of its arts and cultural experience and program. And in a funny way, of course, in the end, and we got a lot of pressure from CNA to talk about economic development. I am an economist, but to me, we have to really start with how fundamentally powerful culture is, all forms of culture, including visual art, music, language, etc. So I do want to say I've given probably 80 talks around the world on creative placemaking since we did our study, and I always use the Arnaudville slides, and I always talk about Arnaudville because it's such an amazing example of what people can do in a small town, building on their own tradition and working hard and using art, visual art, and music, etc. So it's been very inspiring to many people, many places. The talk I'm going to give today was really George's idea. So I asked him, I said, well, what should I say about creative placemaking? My co-author, Ann Nicodemus, will be giving a presentation on Thursday morning in Lafayette about it. And she's been doing a lot more recent work than I have. So he asked me if I would sort of address, the challenges of language revitalization. So I decided to do that, and I'm not necessarily an expert on it, but I have some really good examples from the other end of the Mississippi. So I now live in a small town called Cromwell, Minnesota, which has, an official population of 212 people. I actually live in a township outside, and it's where my grandmother and grandfather lived, and my dad grew up, and my husband lives there. We live there now, so we're struggling with even a smaller town experience than you are, probably. But I'm going to bring you some really interesting stories of language revitalization, one of which was inspired by your experience here in Arnaudville. So, can you see? No, you can't see. I can't pull this very far because it's a hookup. Are you sure? I have some beautiful maps. You're going to want to see them.
I see.
Well, I can back off too. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about language because I've been thinking about it a lot and reading about it a lot. And it is such a powerful, powerful tool and experience. And, language allows us to do so many things. So you think about mammals, and they can grunt, and they can, sort of like make noises. And I do believe, actually, probably that birds have speech. We don't really know, but it's very different than us. So language involves our ability to do so many things, to warn each other, to direct each other to do things, to court, to collaborate, to play together. And you can just imagine, because if you're relating to somebody, I'm trying to do any of these things with somebody who only speaks Chinese and I only speak English, it's very, very difficult. It involves us to learn, and in several ways, by listening, so, by hearing, by watching, words, and by reading. So there's so many different ways in which we use language we don't even really think about most of the time. And also what I love is that by reading in our languages that we have with the translation, we can understand what people were thinking, believing, and aspiring to do centuries ago. So just think about the fact that we can read about Plato and what he was thinking and doing, or we can read Homer and his epics and so on and so forth. And also, language allows us to innovate and delight. It's a very, very powerful tool. There are also important aesthetic uses of language, so storytelling, poetry and spoken word, drama, song. There's so many cultural forms that involve language. So just think about what music would be like without lyrics. So song, in the world of some music, language is just so important, all different kinds of language. I also want to say something about the sounds of language that I've learned from my favorite poet, Mary Oliver. And if you ever read her little book on writing poetry, Mary Oliver is the highest selling poet in the United States. She's in her 80s, and she lives in Florida now, but she lived in New England. And I'm just going to read these lines to you, and I want you to listen to the sounds and how they relate to the text. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. So, can you see what's happening here? Like in these first three phrases, there are all these hard sounds, D's and T's and K's, and because it's about, kind of punishment, self-punishment. But then in this last couple of lines, almost all the words are very, very soft. And so there are just so many things about language, I think, that most of the people like me have never been trained to think about language and stuff, but they're really, really important. And language is also an incredible evolutionary creative process about which we don't know that much. So we know a lot through archaeology about artifacts and how people probably ate and how they hunted and everything else. We don't really understand how all this amazing array of languages emerged. Maybe they know more than I do because I haven't read what they do know, but it's very hard to know because, we don't have any records of what was actually spoken. So we do know, that animals grunted and sang, and maybe they even have some words. But the first people came from Africa, we know that, and they migrated eventually all over the world. And as they migrated, they experienced different climates and territories. They had to change how they ate and what they hunted. And they organized more complex settlements and then cities and so on. And they, it was all differentiated all across the globe. And over hundreds of thousands of years, humans have evolved significant new language groups all over the world. It's kind of really mind-blowing. You can go on the web and look at maps of, languages around the world. It's pretty amazing. Now, the part that's really relevant, I'm getting this all down to sort of like where we live. I at one end of the Mississippi, you the other. We had this incredible era of worldwide migration, conquest, colonialism, and imperialism, starting really with, the ships and crossing the discovery of the New World. And so this produced a lot of amalgamation. And even earlier, if you think about English, what is English an amalgamation of? Well, the Vikings came down there, and it was Gaelic, and then the Viking came, so they introduced Viking words. Then the German, William Orange came over from Normandy and he brought Germanic language. And of course, the Romans were there in the 2nd and 3rd century. And so English is an amazing amalgamation. It's one of the reasons that makes it so difficult for people to learn. Of course, just because of our position in the world over the last century, we kind of forced everybody in the world to speak English, or a lot of people. But it's a very difficult language. I think, the purity of French or Spanish, these other languages, it's much easier to learn. The sounds of are beautiful, But anyway. And we also still have some unique languages in the world that have no counterparts, even in very, places that are integrated otherwise. And Finnish is one example of that. that really the only language that's close to Finnish is Hungarian, but it's not very close at all. So it's so interesting just to think about how that all happened over all these different centuries. Okay, just let's think about North America here. I hope you can see this. This is a map of the migration, not really migration, but really of imperialism, of colonization from European countries, there are these colors up here, down to the Americas. And let's just look at North America. So you can see here are the English-speaking people, you know, up here the fur trading people in Canada and along the eastern seaboard. And then this is the French-speaking settlement that goes all the way from Arcadia down through the Great Lakes region, including Minnesota. We have a lot of French, you know, towns, really important explorers, all the way down to Louisiana and even farther west. And then this is the Spanish portion in North and South America on the west. And of course, there were some Russians here once I came here, the Portuguese, and there are a few other European countries. So you have all these different language groups coming, and basically the people that came, in addition to enslaving native people. I'm just reading this book called The Other Slavery, which is, I didn't know that Christopher Columbus actually took people from the West Indies and sold them back into Portugal and Spain. And mostly they were women. Women were more desirable because what they wanted were housekeepers and, you know, to do all that kind of work. So it's really different than, you know, in the cotton fields and so on. So you have this really extraordinary history about how these different groups and language groups came to us, and then of course we have a whole history of how English, you know, the English and then Americans who were mainly English Americans spread across the continent. So this is a part of our history and the challenge. Now, it's really interesting that no unified language emerged during colonization, and I think that's for a lot of reasons. There was so much competition between these countries, and there was a lot of surplus in an economic sense. So they could afford, you know, these kings and queens of Spain and Portugal, they could afford to outfit Christopher Columbus and other people to go back and across and figure out what to do and bring back botanics and try to figure out what kind of crops they could grow and sell internationally and so on. And there was also a lot of warfare in that period of time. I have a cousin who, my brother's wife is Irish, but she's black Irish. She's very dark hair. She's from when the Spanish Armada got sunk off the coast of Ireland. So somebody back in and her last name is Carlos. That's her Irish last name. Okay, so, and also, the other thing is just resistance. So there was so much investment already in native people who managed to survive, you know, the terrors of colonization. They stuck to their native tongues, their native language, and often the people colonizing had to adopt to that. I also wanted just to mention, I don't know that much about it, but there was this big effort to create a world language in the last century called Esperanto. You can read about it online. And I did learn by looking a little bit online that 12 million people around the world do speak Esperanto today. And it's a very interesting language because it took really the Latin language idea, like one consonant, one vowel, you know, and not too complex, and not that hard to pronounce, and really made a language. You can just see the word kind of looks a lot like Spanish or even French or whatever, Esperanto. So that's an interesting story in itself. Now, there was a lot of disruptive language change on the North American continent over the last 2 or 3 centuries. And the very first part was Native American elimination, the forced, you know, the genocide and the forced removal of people, confinement to reservations. I'm going to show maps of that in a minute. And then there was colonial migration and settlement, which was so mixed, because you had German people coming to Pennsylvania and English people coming to New England and a lot of other different kind of people. And of course, you know, I'll show a map of that in a minute too. And then we had African slavery, the importation of African slaves who had all different kinds of tongues, which were mostly suppressed. And unfortunately, their musical traditions and their musicality and their instruments and their movement and rhythm have survived very powerfully in American music. And we had forced migration at the end. I'm just reading this wonderful book that I recommend, The Half Has Never Been Told, which is much about Louisiana. It's by Edward Baptiste, who's a professor at Cornell, and it's about the sales of slaves after the end of the slave trade, when you could no longer, after 1808, you couldn't import slaves from Africa, but on the East Coast plantations, they were selling, including Thomas Jefferson, selling slaves, and including my university, Georgetown, which I'll tell you about a little later, into that growing area of cotton growing in Louisiana and Alabama, Mississippi and Alabama, Mississippi and so on. So this also, and by the way, many of these slaves were walked in chains from Maryland and Virginia, et cetera, all the way to Louisiana, et cetera. These are the native languages. This is a really cool map. These are all the native languages in North America before the Europeans arrived. And it's very interesting to see. So the yellow are the Siouan languages, and it shows even a little bit of that down here in Louisiana. I don't know what the story about that is. And then the green are Algic, like Algonquin, et cetera, language. And that includes the Ojibwe, which is the language that's being revitalized in my area, the Iroquoian, and so on. This is a Puto-Aztecan, so it came up from Mexico originally. And this is Athabasca, and this is the whole part of the country that's not all Apache and so on and so forth. So there are all these different languages. There are hundreds of languages that Native Americans evolved, and some of them extremely different from each other. I just think that whole process is kind of really a mind-blowing thing. And this is what happened, to Native Americans in the southern part of the country. The really dark spaces were very heavily populated, and pretty much by, westernized. They spoke English, they went to school, Cherokee, etc. So all these people were removed forcefully. They were marched from where they lived up to Oklahoma in the 1830s, so I forget exactly when. Seminoles also. Seminoles from 1832 to 1833. These are very, very terrible chapters of American history. And it was really because white people wanted their land. That was really the story. This is where native groups, native languages are still alive today. So these are the only places in the U.S. with some real concentrations of Native Americans. And it includes this whole area, which is Navajo, et cetera, and Hopi, et cetera. This is Pine Ridge Sioux reservations and some, et cetera. But you can see that in the almost entire eastern half of the U.S., including Louisiana, almost no Native Americans. I mean, we know there are Native Americans among us, and et cetera, but very small percentage of the population. This is a map of the domestic slave trade. So I think this is very important to understand how key this is after 1808. That all of these plantations here were very challenged. They couldn't import slaves from Africa. The tobacco industry was really declining. They grew other things like wheat, et cetera. And the big, rich opening lands here were where things were happening. There was a lot of migration even from the cotton-growing, states on the eastern seaboard west. And they needed slaves really badly in this whole Mississippi and Louisiana area. So I have a personal story to tell about this that just happened to me this year that really blew my mind. So I was coming back from my annual cross-country ski trip on the North Shore that I organize every year, alone in my four-wheel drive truck. And I put on the radio, and there was this amazing American Public Radio documentary about my university, Georgetown University, and how it owned slaves and sold slaves in the early 19th century. And in the year 1838, they sold 272 slaves into Louisiana, into the Louisiana slave market, and most of them ended up in some of the worst plantations. We just went to the Slavery Museum yesterday, and we learned all about how sugar cane was so much worse than cotton growing, just like the conditions of work and all of that. So what happened was that the Georgetown University is a Catholic university, and they had kept meticulous records of their slaves who were growing wheat and tobacco in Maryland. So they owned slaves in Maryland, but they needed money to buy land in Washington, D.C. for their university that I attended. And so they sold them, but they kept meticulous records. So they have all these records of actually their slaves' names and their ages and who they married and everything else. It's very unusual because most African-American people in the U.S. have no ability to trace their ancestry. So the university actually came forward. Many other universities, by the way, all the Ivy League universities, even Rutgers, where I taught for 10 years, which is now a public university, all of them owned slaves and traded slaves. And most of the other universities have just had these little conferences like, oh, what should we do? We're so sorry we did this. But Georgetown decided to really build a slavery archive and open it up to research. And they set up a committee to say, what should we do in reparations? What should we do for this part of our history? And so this committee recommended that they give preference to children of descendants, if they could find any, and that they also would offer them scholarships. The university decided to only do the first and not the second, which is very sad. But an alum in Boston heard about this, and he wrote to the committee. He said, well, what happened to these 272 people? And they said, oh, they all died. That was the answer. And he said, that's not possible. There were survivors even of the Titanic. And so he made it his, project to find out. And he found a genealogist in Baton Rouge, and he got together with her, and of course, there are tons of cemeteries in Louisiana, small towns. There are Catholic cemeteries with the white people on one side and the slaves on the other side with their names and everything else. So he was able to discover a lot about these 272 people, not all of them, but a lot of them. And he created this Georgetown Memory Project. I belong to it, a lot of other alums from, and we have helped to fund an effort that's now involves a lot of Louisiana African-American people in finding out who the ancestors are and finding cousins they never knew they had. And for them, it's been a powerful thing. And one woman named Millie, who is a chef in New Orleans, 58 years old, she's the first person to be living in a dorm in Georgetown going to school. She said, yeah, I want to do that. I want to go. And there even was a Washington Post article about her. And they also last spring, I wish I'd known this because I would have gone, Georgetown had kind of a reparations mass, and they invited descendants, and over 100 of them came, mostly from Louisiana. And the president of the university apologized to them. The woman who's head of the Native American, that's my area, African American memory group here, got up and said that's not enough, and said these people, and talked about their lives, what kind of lives they lived, their ancestors, and then at the end of the service they sang Amazing Grace. And this woman, Millie, in the papers is quoted as saying, this was the most meaningful thing to me because at the end of Amazing Grace, the last line was blind, but now I see. And now, she said, we know who our ancestors were. We know who our relatives and our cousins are. To me, this is just a really powerful, beautiful story. So, and I believe that there is a movement in the United States now to really open up this whole period of slavery and, the experience of Native Americans, and for the rest of us to really understand it. So, it's a really important experience. Okay, so what happened in the United States? Well, beginning in the 19th century, there was a new public schooling initiative, which was a very good thing. It started in the East, that everybody should go to public school. It should be paid for by local government, and there shouldn't just be Harvards for rich young men. That's all that was at the beginning, and so on and so forth. So they created normal schools to teach teachers how to teach, and these teachers went, and then the normal schools all taught in English, because this all sort of started on the East Coast, which was pretty much by then all English speaking. And so in every little hamlet, like my grandmother graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1908 and went out to teach school, and she taught in high school, but in the community that she came to, there were a lot of Finnish, very high percentage of Finnish Americans, and they mainly spoke Finnish. Their parents spoke Finnish at home. So where's my husband? He's over in the corner. Rod, would you raise your hand? It's my husband, Rod Wally. All his grandparents born in Finland, and 9 kids in his family. And when his oldest sister went to school, she was treated very, very poorly by the teacher, who was very freaked out because the kids were coming and they only spoke Finn, and that wasn't okay. They had to be stomped out. So his parents decided to stop speaking Finn at home. And the sad thing about it is he never learned Finn because he was one of the younger kids. But I'll tell you the rest of that story a little later. So this was very common across the country. So this was sort of movement, for 100 years, that schools would only really teach English. And of course you could take French or Spanish or whatever it is a little bit in, high school maybe or college, but, it wasn't, the priority was really to be an English-speaking only country. And that continued for a very long time. So, and even, not that long ago, there was huge opposition to Spanish as a second language. Now, that's become a second language in a lot of states, but there was this idea that somehow it would confuse children if they learned two languages at once, just children. I mean, this is just the craziest thing because, here you have all this evidence from Europe. You go to the Netherlands and people speak 4 or 5 languages. Dutch, French, German, English, etc. And they're really smart and they do really well. I mean, you look at a country that's a high-performing small countries in Europe, the Netherlands is really one of them. So that is a really important part of what we're doing. So this brings me to the end of my talk, and I hope we can have some interaction. We're supposed to be doing an activity, and what is the activity time period supposed to be here?
George, Jackie, 10:30, 11, 12, a half hour.
Oh yeah, okay, great, yeah. So the last part is about language revitalization elsewhere, some of it inspired by what's happening in Arnaudville. And this includes, in my end of the Mississippi, we have 2 really exciting language revitalization processes going on. One is Native American people, Ojibwa language tables, and the other is the Finnish language restoration. So I'm going to talk about the Ojibwa first. So we have a lot of Ojibwa reservations in Minnesota. They're mostly in the northern part of the state. This is where Rod and I live very near Fond du Lac. And Fond du Lac is a very successful reservation for reasons I'll talk about. Down here we have Sioux reservations. They're very small. They're actually not reservations, they're communities. But these are reservations where the land is owned by the Native people, and an amazing thing has happened to them over time. So in these communities, some elders still speak Ojibwa, and today, through colleges and universities, there are strong American Indian Studies programs, and they really foster in our state the Ojibwa language. And there's a lot of academic research. They've written dictionaries, and there are books for kids and adults in Ojibwa now. So it's really, as much as, like what's happening in your region, there's really a revitalization going on. And language tables are really proliferating. Now, I want to go back and talk about the instruments of suppression because they're so important. So for the Ojibwa people, the instruments of language suppression were really, first of all, the boarding schools. So these boarding schools were set up by the U.S. government in the late 19th century. And the whole idea was to take children away from their families and make them English-speaking Americans. And it happened all over the country. It happened with a vengeance in our part of the country. By about 1912, the U.S. government decided they wanted to get out of that business, so the religious organizations took over, Catholics and Protestants and so on. And they ran these boarding schools. And often it was linked to Christianization as well. So, to get rid of the old traditions and so on. And I have a wonderful story to tell from my friend in Northwood. It's a terrible story, actually, a couple of them, about how terrible these boarding schools were. So Jim Northwood, let's just go back here and see these maps, grew up here. And the boarding school they took, he and his sister to, was way down here, Pikesville, Minnesota. He's like, 7 years old. They put him on a bus and took him down here to a barracks-like place. When he got off the bus and spoke to his sister in Ojibwa, he didn't know any other language. He was slapped and told he could not speak Ojibwa. That night in the dormitory, he said, I can almost never tell so Frank, he said, all these boys are lined up in beds in this barracks. And one boy starts crying at the end of the door, and pretty soon every boy in the place is crying. So this is just a terrible, terrible experience, in American history, which we need to really deal with. So, and there are a lot of challenges that come from this history of being forced off your own land and into places. Some of it, especially this one here, is an amalgam of people from a lot of different tribes, and it's like the most problematic one. This one almost very poor because it's very far north, and there's basically almost no kind of work there for people. But this one is fortunately on kind of there's a really highly populated area in this region. But the really great thing that happened to Native reservations in Minnesota was, did I put this in here? Yeah, this is what's changed. The casino laws. So in 1989, the US government decided that Native Americans only could have casinos because they had treaties that said they were sovereign nations and that they could govern themselves. And so this has been an incredibly powerful thing in Minnesota because for the most part, these reservations have done brilliant things with their casino money. In our Fond du Lac community, they've built a whole school system, but a lot of their kids also go to the public school. They built a community college called Fond du Lac Community College, and it has nursing programs and law enforcement programs, among other things, so that they can hire their own people to do those things. And now it has more white people in it than Native people, so they lost their Bureau of Indian Affairs funding, but they don't care because it's allowed them to hire more people, and everybody's getting along, and a lot of the white kids want to learn Ojibwa, and so it's a very, very successful place and a very beautiful place with really powerful cultural singing and dancing events as well. This is one of my favorite people, Jim Northrup. He just died 2 years ago. A Vietnam vet, a humorist, a playwright, an author, and just an very important elder and leader. And I had a little clip of him speaking Ojibwa at the language table because he's only learning it himself, but it doesn't really work in here. I couldn't figure out how to do it. And he told me at one point how he writes. He also wrote a humorous, spoofing paper about his tribal council all the time. Every week he wrote this thing, the Fond du Lac Follies. So he was really willing, to use his writing skill. And he was very friendly to everybody. My husband's laughing. To write these hilarious things about all the dumb things his tribal council was doing. And I really think it helped in the longer run to change and, to challenge the way things had been done for a long time. So here he is, he's writing, and he taught me something very important. I interviewed him, I wrote about him in a big study I did with a Native American writer partner. And he said, when I write, I first sit down at my kitchen table and I pretend that you're sitting there across the table and I speak what I'm going to write. And then I know kind of the language I want to use in what I write. And that's a very powerful thing. Right now, I'm writing weekly columns for all 4 of our rural weekly papers because I feel like there have to be other voices in the era of what's happening in Washington. So, and I've been writing often about Native Americans, but also lots of other things, visual art and music and so on, and economics. So I use his technique. It's really true. The spoken word is so powerful. And if you write the way you speak, you're using stronger verbs, more powerful, shorter sentences. But somehow in universities and schools, we've taught children that good writing is like long, complicated, complex, convoluted sentences, very bad. So I learned that from him. Did I say that? That he just pretends that you're across the table and he's just speaking to you and then he writes it. So here he is at language table. So they have not only language tables that run every weekend. I went for quite a while, not because I really wanted to learn Ojibwa, but I just for support, because it was fun, because the first hour was a feast. Like everybody brought something and then we shared all the food, and the second hour was working on Ojibwa. And in summer they have a language camp, which also has canoe racing, which I've done with a couple of daughters of a friend of mine, and we've done really well. And a lot of craft work, a lot of beading, porcupine quill work, all that kind of things are taught there. But language is the very central part of it. And here's a group of elders doing their language table. Sorry, there's so much light in here. We can really turn those up. And these are kids, a kid's part of it, and another one as well. And also there's been a lot of modernization, which I love. So this woman here, Liz Jacqua, she's half Finnish and half Ojibwa. And she was an opera singer. She was at Siena at the opera camp, and she realized that everybody was the other women were so competitive, she just quit and went home. She said, this isn't my culture to be competitive like this. And she's become an incredible musician, music teacher. She teaches at the college, but she also sings in most of the Duluth, kind of high-end choral works. She decided she wanted to start a women's drum group. Traditionally, only men drum in Ojibwa culture. So she was very smart about how she did it. She worked for 2 or 3 years. She worked with the elders. And she kept just explaining to them that there were other women they really would like to play, drums, that they were capable of doing it and they would like to do that. And so we did it. And so after a few years, the elders said, okay, this is her drum group. This is at least 10 years ago playing in the state capitol, in the foyer of our state capitol. And this is just a few weeks ago, they opened a wonderful new housing center that's also an arts and culture space. Thank you, that really helped. In Duluth, and they're sitting at that as well. This is Jack over himself as well. And at many, many events, they do that. This is our Native Artist Study. If you're interested in it, these are all the artists that we interviewed, and we really not only talked about them and their work and their challenges and how they became artists of all forms, by the way, musicians, writers, etc., but also about gatekeepers, all the gatekeepers who opened doors for them, who closed doors on them, and partly because our funder, which was the McKnight Foundation, wanted us to really figure out how to help Native artists get greater visibility and make better income. And this is my final slide, or 2 slides. This is the Finnish language table in our community, Cromwell, run and begun by my husband, Ronwell, and inspired by the Arnaudville language tables. So, yes.
Voin korjata miten. I can fix anything. Mutta joskus minun tarvitsee iso mokkari. And sometimes I need a huge sledgehammer.
Thank you. So it was, the other day I turned to him and I said, did you start that Finnish language table because of Arnaudville? And he said, yeah, that's where I got the whole idea. And, I hadn't quite connected with that. But, yes, so he never learned any Finnish, but there are all these elders in our community who spoke it as children. And so at our assisted living, we have a very nice assisted living place right down the road from us. He goes in, he's been doing, how many years have you been doing this?
About 5.
Yeah.
I started right after
Yeah.
I got the idea here.
Yes, I think we were here in 2012. And here's just another picture. You can see how much fun there. They do, besides he brings in movies, there's a lot of music and singing and telling stories, letters that people write from Finland that need to be, translated. And it's a really beautiful thing. And so we've been to Finland a couple of times, and the frustration was that one of his cousins, the one who would put it up in her house, she couldn't speak any English, and we couldn't speak any Finnish. So it's hard at the breakfast table to really relate if you can't speak at all. So we did a lot of other things. She made us beautiful little socks and everything else. And younger people do speak Finnish, but he wanted to be able to go back and speak to her. So, and then I said, okay, it's time for you to go back, and you have to go by yourself, because if I go with you, you're going to be speaking English. So he went by himself, and it was really successful. He was really able to talk to all these cousins that he has his age and their kids in Finnish. So that's the end of that. So, yeah, these are just a quick list of challenges to language revitalization, because I'd really rather have some discussion with you. So I'm just going to list them, and we could go through them. One is dialect differences. So I know that that's an issue for you in Louisiana with French. Race, religion, class, and regional differences. That's another very big one. Even, between the different Ojibwa reservations in Minnesota, there are really big differences. Between native speakers and those who speak it as a second language. And one of the solutions is to welcome these differences and to work to understand them. And I think the public officials and people who spoke today earlier really demonstrated that. That's what you do. You work from where you are, and you do the best, and you don't really apologize. You just show your willingness to try and to want to learn and to participate. And that seems to really work. And I also just think how, especially from African Americans, there's so many things about our culture that come from African Americans that we mostly haven't acknowledged. And those include music, spirituals. There's a whole musicology about how movement and rhythm in American music has come from Africa, which is really kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, because nobody ever taught me that. And to folk and blues and jazz, very, very important contributions. And probably there are many more. So I feel like this is a time in American culture where, we have this possibility to move forward in just diversification of language and culture, because we still have elders that still speak languages, and in many cases now, it's happened like here, which is very wonderful. And I think a lot of younger people are really interested in language and learning a language, and so I don't know, it's going to be a big challenge because all the young people are so busy doing Facebook and everything else in English. I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, I wanted to, how much do we have time till noon? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay, good.
If you need it to stay longer, it's okay.
Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to do this free writing exercise, but first I'd like to just ask you if you have any responses to this, or any, anything you'd like to, speak back about, or, yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I moved down here 4 years ago from Washington State. And there are, they're called Indian tribes because of course Salish tribes cross the Canadian border.
Yes.
So it's not Native American per se, it's the
Yes.
Salish. And the Washington State legislators passed a law that said that Native speakers, Salish language speakers, could teach in schools without having to go to college and get a degree to teach. And so that has really helped to reinvigorate the language.
That's a brilliant idea, because it really changes.
The barrier.
Yeah, great. Yeah, because the school rules about teaching are kind of rigid in a lot of places. Yeah. Other thoughts or insights? Yeah. Can you say your name too? Here, I'll do this session.
Hello, I'm Beatrice Bellamy. I'm deputy mayor in France, in Orléans, and I've come to join your animation and talk about the French and everything is in French.
You can speak in French, and I can sort of understand it.
Perhaps I can.
If I don't, somebody will.
The question in English, like that everybody can understand. I want to know if you mentioned that in US now there is a recognition about the slavery, and a lot of people talk about that. There is some research now about DNA. More easily. Do you think that these both things help to develop the speaking and the known about French speaking and the history of the language coming in the US?
That's a great question. I'm really just an economist, so I don't really know, but I think it's a great question. I think that's what's happening now, is that people are asking these questions and realizing we have these tools like DNA, or we have these archives at Georgetown University. We have different ways. And also Thomas Jefferson, he and some other, there were some sort of like more intelligent slave, owners, I won't say compassion because they weren't, but and they taught English often to their slaves, and so some of those slaves were, and then of course we have these slave narratives, which are amazing. And it's amazing, I don't know if people know this, yesterday I was there, I had to tell the guy this because he didn't know it. So the entire American history profession was opposed to the slave narratives, which were paid for by the Federal Writers Project, because they didn't believe that oral history was reliable. And I mean, it's appalling when you think about it. Like, are you kidding me? The people's telling their own stories and experience was not accepted by the American history. But fortunately, the federal government was very powerful in that day and had a very powerful precedent behind it, and it survived. So thank you for asking that question. I think the DNA thing would be really interesting. And I feel like I'm hoping that books like this and the book, The Other Slavery, about Native American slavery, especially in Mexico, but working up through the West Coast. I mean, there was a lot of Native American slavery that we don't even hardly know about in the U.S. So, yeah, Joseph.
I would also, I'm Joseph. So the slave narratives are great, but one of the things that we forget in Louisiana is that we are programmed, and have been programmed since 1921, to see ourselves within a larger American English-speaking context. And so Louisiana is not that. It's an extension of the French colonial experience. And so language informs identity. And I'm going to talk about that actually in a little while. But when you mention, for example, the slave narratives, those were all done in English. There was nothing done in Louisiana with the Creole, the French-speaking people who had been enslaved. And
So what we're finding now, actually, those of us who work in that realm, the slave narratives that were done after the end of the Civil War, not the slave narratives, excuse me, the Civil War pension records, which have been recently released, provide lots of very interesting details about the experiences of Creole-speaking enslaved people in Louisiana. And there were often very huge language conflicts happening because when these men were being interviewed to establish the veracity of their claims, these were all Americans coming into Louisiana who were only speaking English. And these men, and even sometimes their widows, were not English speakers. And so there was lots and lots of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth through interpreters, legal proceedings, this and that and the other, where in some cases they finally were able to obtain their pensions, but in other cases, because something was not immediately translated correctly, because the person was trying to say an English word that he or she couldn't say in French or in Creole that was mistranscribed, they would be denied their pensions. So when we talk about language, you have to think about whoever controls the language controls the politics, it controls the economy, it controls identities. And so we don't have in Louisiana the concept of linguistic minorities. When we think about minorities as Americans, we think of skin color. We don't think about language as a minority concept. And we don't think about language as also a baseline for identity, but I'll get more into that later. So it's something to keep in perspective when we're thinking about language in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's really good. I would say that Hispanic speaking is a category in the U.S. Census, and it's been very problematic. But but that whole idea of it's Spanish speaking is really the definition of Latino.
Exactly.
And that's changing because first of all, there are racial differences in that group, and then it's just fascinating. The census is so problematic.
But the other thing with the Spanish-speaking population is that there's political consumer power behind it.
Yeah.
So that adds a whole other dynamic to that categorization as far as census records go, because they're trying to measure at a federal level or local levels what those people's political and economic power is.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because the whole census, the fastest growing category in census is multiracial. It's growing fast in this country, so that's really interesting. Other thoughts or comments? If you don't have other thoughts or comments,